Steve Touw, co-founder and chief technology officer at Immuta. Welcome to the Data Exchange podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Ben. I'm excited. It's been a while since we got to chat. Too bad it's not in person, but
Yes,
happy to be here.
I think we first met in London, probably around the time of GDPR, if I recall.
Yeah, that's probably like 4 years ago now. I would be my guess, something like that, maybe 5.
Yeah. By the way, as I was preparing for this, I discovered an interesting factoid about Steve Touw,
Oh yeah.
which is he started out in GIS. For our listeners, this is Geographic Information Systems, which, by the way, became super hot and important over the last year because of COVID-19, because
That's right.
all of the public sector health agencies, public health agencies use GIS systems.
That's right. GIS was kind of how I cut my teeth, I guess, in software engineering, because it's not just about the maps, but laying information on top of maps in a way that allows you to do complex analysis. So I kind of fell in love with the software engineering world side of that. My degree was actually geography in undergrad. So every time I tell someone that, they laugh and say, "Well, what's the state capital of Illinois?" So
pretty much, I
but
think
yeah.
if you consumed a COVID kind of dashboard over the last year, there's high probability that it touched the GIS system.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about how that data would also have to be anonymized to make that all work so that it could be publicly consumable. Yeah.
Yeah. So then at some point, you and your friends started Immuta. So tell us, what was the genesis behind the company and how has it evolved? Has it stuck with its original thesis and assumptions?
No, no one's that good, I don't think. Have you ever met someone that stuck with the original plan? So the
Elon Musk.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, he's got a little bit on me, I guess. The so my background is, I mentioned geography degree. I went to the University of Maryland. I grew up in the DC area, and we did a lot of government services, and a lot of that work was with the intelligence community, some 3-letter agencies that I'll leave nameless, but you can probably guess. And we found we were doing a lot of data analytics for them, geospatial type analysis being some of those. And we found ourselves having to build over and over again these tools to manage fine-grained access control, because eventually, like when we built something, it was something that we would hand off to like downstream analysts that couldn't see as much data as we could. So we were like, man, this has got to be a problem that exists in the real world. So, well, not the real world, but like the non Intel community world, I should say. And so we originally our plan was, how do we make it easier for application developers to anonymize data, because that's kind of our roots and where we came from. We were building analytical applications, and we wanted kind of like libraries to help enable anonymization of data. But we quickly found that there was a stronger appetite for live analytical use cases against data that required anonymization and fine-grained access control. And the reason is because at that level, that's where all your ad hoc questions exist. When you have real humans asking ad hoc questions in real time as real-time use cases come on their plate, then it's really hard to a priori think about like every single access control policy you need to have in place. So how do you build some automation around that? How do you make that easier? How do you modernize how you create access control for the environment that we live in, the data analytics environment that we live in today? And so that's kind of how we changed directions. Yeah, go ahead.
So Steve, I imagine the 3-letter agencies, we're talking a lot of maybe files and text, PDFs, notes. And then in companies, you're more probably talking about structured data in databases. So is that the case? Did you guys have to transition?
I mean, I can't get into too much detail, but suffice it to say, it was a lot of structured data, actually, very granular and sensitive structured data. So we've always been focused in the structured space,
Okay.
mostly because the the types of controls that people want, the granularity they want, requires structure in the data. Things like anonymizing at the column or cell level, removing rows from data. So
So,
frankly,
so for our listeners who don't follow this closely, so there's levels of control. You can have access control at the column level, or at the row level, or at even the cell level, right?
yeah. So the cell level is meaning not the entire column, but pieces of a column based on other things that share the row with that cell.
So you guys went from the public sector, and how did you validate the product in the private sector?
Yeah, good question. So we initially kicked off with some financial institution customers because they're kind of like the next logical step when you're talking about sensitive data, obviously with a lot of regulatory controls. But then what kind of happened is this explosion of awareness of privacy and data privacy because your data is being collected everywhere, right? And I think people are finally starting to realize that and put pressure on the these companies that collect their data to treat their data more fairly and be more liable for what their internal users are doing with this data subject data. So it's really exploded. I would make the argument that any data is sensitive data now if it pertains to your customers, and you can't just have you know everyone seeing everyone's social security number and credit card number when they're analyzing data. And I think the world's begun to realize this. So while we started at financial institutions and found a great need there, we then moved to health and life sciences and insurance. Now it's just everybody. We've got, you name it, we've got a customer in that sector.
So what about the timing? So I mentioned GDPR earlier. Did you folks existed before GDPR, and then of
That's
course
right.
GDPR uh, and now California privacy regulations have taken it to another level. It's no longer just access control; it's also just kind of the right to be purged or forgotten.
Yeah, there's all kinds of regulatory complexities, and they're all slightly different in how they treat both how personal information is defined, but also how you have to protect it and to the levels that you need to protect it. So this gets really, really confusing if you're a multinational corporation that, I mean, you potentially are dealing with hundreds of privacy regulations at the same time on the same data, which gets super complex. But I'll be honest, like that's one side of the coin. Frankly, a lot of our customers use us more for what I talked about a little bit ago, which is they just want to do the right thing and make sure they're protecting their data subjects data. So it's not necessarily that they're trying to like follow the letter of the law.
Mhm.
They're saying, hey, look, we need to be a responsible organization with our data subjects data. Like, how do we best do that? And so I'm like happy to see that happening.
So what are the things that make this challenging? So I imagine it's the usual things that make big data challenging, right? So now you have more data, you have more sources of data, particularly with software as a service and cloud computing. I mean, you have companies that have only 20 people, but they may have 200 different software products that they're using. So their
Yeah.
data is flowing from all sorts of different directions, different data types. And then I think the one thing that, and then of course real time, but the one dimension of this that I think Steve is a bit underappreciated is just the explosion in the number of users of data, right? So before, maybe data scientists, analysts, developers. Now, within companies, more and more people are demanding access to data so that they can make better decisions. They want that data as fresh as possible, as reliable and high quality as possible, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would also argue those users of the data that want the data are much more advanced. It's no longer they're going into an application and clicking 6 buttons and out comes the blueberry pie. Like they want to actually start from scratch analyze the data, build machine learning models. Like they need ad hoc direct access to the data instead of kind of data shim layer that some application that someone builds analysts. Like that shim layer between the database and the analyst has gone away now, and it's just how do we get the analyst directly access to the data? That they may be using tools like BI tools or like data science tools, certainly, but it's just kind of like that idea that they need to be able to get to the right data to do their job whenever they want. And that's really added a lot of complexity. The other thing, I mean, you touched on it, but multiple computes in the cloud world. Like we did a survey a few months ago, and we found that not only does over 50% of companies believe they have sensitive data that they need to analyze, but an even higher percentage of companies, I think it's somewhere in the 70s, I forget the exact percentage, are using multiple data warehouses or compute engines. So if you imagine you have a bunch of data in Databricks, a bunch of data in Snowflake, maybe you have some data in Redshift, how do you consistently enforce controls? Like if you have to do it uniquely for every single database, or if you have to do it uniquely for every application that sits on top of those databases, that just becomes an impossible proposition to maintain.
As a technical advisor to Databricks, I recommend you just put everything in Databricks.
Yeah, we are very we are a very strong partner of Databricks.
And, no, but obviously the reality is people not only use multiple systems, they may even be in multiple clouds. In fact, exactly. I did a meta-analysis of surveys, and I found that most companies actually have more than one cloud provider.
Yep. So that's the challenge. Like, how do you manage this in a maintainable way? Because if you have point solutions across all those, and someone needs to change a rule, I mean, that could feasibly take an organization months to go around to each of those point solutions and change that policy. Whereas you really need to be able to, and this is what Immuta gives you, change that policy, a single policy in one place that propagates itself to all the different computes. And so we call that, just like you had to separate compute from storage to scale the big data era, we say you have to separate policy from compute to scale in the data privacy era.
So organizationally and in terms of company culture, how does data governance work in a typical company? Is it still back in the old days, Steve? The data warehouse people kind of determined who had access to what, right? So now with so many different systems, how does a system like Immuta work? So who owns data governance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I see us as the modern way to do data governance. I think when we originally started the company, we kind of had part of our thesis that was wrong, was that we're going to sell to the legal and compliance teams in these organizations because they're making the rules, and like we can make it so that they can implement their own rules on the data.
Legal and compliance, they don't know anything about the data, the details of the data, right? So
that's part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is, not to disparage, I've got lawyers that work for us, but disparage lawyers and those types, but they kind of create the memo with the rule and consider their job done. It's not their job to implement the rule, it's their job to interpret the rules. So what that means is they could give a crap about Immuta because that's how you implement the rules. And so the people that care about Immuta are the data platform teams, the people that are managing the data and the compute, the data engineering teams. They buy Immuta because they need some way to take the legal and compliance rules that are being pushed onto them, along with all their other concerns that they have to deal with, and deliver on that. And it's not only deliver to the legal and compliance teams that are pressuring them, but it's also deliver to the analysts in a way where if they follow all the rules that the legal compliance team gives them, are they making all the data so useless that no one can do any analytics out of it anymore? So it's this balance between utility and privacy that they need to maintain. And I always say this, that if you do governance right, you're actually giving analysts access to more data, because you are playing, I call it like a dimmer switch versus a light switch. If you do everything very coarsely and naively with how you implement controls, you're going to end up with useless data because you're going to have so many privacy rules coming down the pipe at you, because you just can't get to a level of granularity that gives you the utility you need. So when you use something like Immuta, it gives you this dimmer switch where instead of turning off an entire column, you could anonymize it so it still meets the privacy principles required, but also enables valuable analytics against it. So this is why I think everyone should be thinking about not only how they do data governance, but how they think about data anonymization as a whole, rather than just like turning off access at the table level or column level.
So we talked there. So we mentioned that there's more data, more sources of data, more users of data. So a lot of things are really exploding in scale. So you could, uh, uh, I would imagine that even in the data governance space, Steve, there are tools that uh, increase the productivity of people who have to manage data governance. So in other words, are you using data to help augment and make the data governance leads more productive? So in other words, uh, there might be data sources or pieces of data where no one uses, so maybe you shouldn't worry about them too much. You know what I mean? So
Yes,
are you mining data to improve your data governance policies?
right. So this is a real critical piece for scalability. So I think there's two pieces that you need to think about with data governance software solutions. And this actually aligns kind of well to how you think about databases. But the two things are scalability and stability. Scalability, to get scalability, there needs to be some data introspection, which is what you're talking about. So what we can do, for example, is understand where all the sensitive data lives. So we can peek at the data, say this looks like social security number or credit card, or let the customer build their own kind of algorithms and plug them into our framework for discovering their own unique types of data. And once you have that metadata layer or semantic layer built on top of your data, and by the way, we can pull that in from other systems if you've already done that work somewhere else, then you get a ton of scalability from that perspective because you can build rules at that meta layer. So again, going back to our example of I've got some data in Databricks and some data in Starburst, let's say. Well, I guess it's not in Starburst, but you get my point.
Yeah.
You could build that semantic layer on top of there. And instead of saying mask this table in Databricks and this column, you could say mask anywhere we see social security numbers. And that rule can propagate across that meta layer across all your compute engines. So that's a scalability piece that requires us to understand what your
It's
data
like
looks like.
it's like an automation tool. You just kind of
Right.
specify certain things. Yeah.
That's right. So that's a great example. You also mentioned just what are users doing in the system, so we can expose all that audit information.
Yeah,
Um,
the whole is governance top down or bottom up?
right, or proactive or reactive. So
Right.
we take a mostly proactive approach, but you can do reactive things with our auditing as well.
And yeah, so it seems like so data governance fits into this new area that people are coalescing around called data ops, which basically is so in my mind, anything ops has three components, right? So automation, monitoring, incident response. And so data ops has to do with making sure that as companies depend more and more on data, that you can supply data in a reliable, timely, safe, high quality way. And it
Mm-hmm.
seems to me that data governance is like a building block for any kind of data ops function.
That's absolutely right, and I think that ties right into what I said. So I said scalability. I think what you're talking about now is stability, um, and it absolutely is a foundational piece. We believe we actually have seen a huge movement for what we call policy as code. So just like you have infrastructure as code, you want to be able to manage your data access policies in a similar way that you would manage your data pipelines or your data infrastructure. So you could source control your policy definitions. You could manage pull requests against that, or like have people approve changes. If you source control that, you can understand change over time. And so we allow you to take this kind of approach of declaring your policy state in declarative files, source controlling those and pushing those to Immuta to represent that state. And we've seen a huge demand for that because everyone wants stability in their foundational data ops pieces. And so this not only applies to things like data access control, but also data quality has similar stability desires in these organizations. And the other thing that kind of helps drive this that you already talked about is the metadata, right? In order to make this all work, you need to know everything about all your systems in a single place. And so we consider ourselves that metadata hub, if you will, or centralization of the metadata. So I mentioned the semantic layer. We also understand the physical layer, but it's not only those pieces, it's also who the users are. That's metadata too, and helps drive policy. So we can layer that in from multiple systems. So it's not just Active Directory or LDAP, which groups you belong to or what roles you have, but also we could say, Ben had this training, Steve didn't. He should be able to see more than Steve. And you can layer in all that kind of user attribution too, to drive these policies. And so centralization of metadata is a key aspect of data ops in our opinion.
It's increasingly becoming a foundational layer, metadata.
That's right.
Hey, Steve, so in terms of, so we talked a little bit about the metadata, data governance tools, but what about in your mind, because you talk to a lot of companies who have to grapple with data governance, what is the best way to organize a team for data governance? So in other words, when you talk to companies and they ask you, okay, so we want to roll this out, so how do we organize ourselves?
Yeah, I mean,
is it chief data officer? Is there a central person normally?
No, I think it's what we've seen and I think has been successful is it's the data platform owner. The same people that are in charge of data ops should be in charge of your governance. Now, there's going to be more stakeholders, I think.
But they're propeller heads, they're engineers.
Well, the data platform lead isn't necessarily the propeller head, right? Yeah. And so they certainly have a lot more stakeholders when it comes to data governance, specifically the legal and compliance teams. But it's on them to implement the rules at the end of the day. Like they need to deliver value from data.
By the way, as we're talking about it occurred to me. So you might have already encountered this, but there are companies where it's so sprawling. You can imagine a global bank. There's a CIO in London. There's a CIO in New York. There's a CIO in Singapore. So how do you do this? How do you do this?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. Yeah. So this is I'm sure you've heard the term data mesh being thrown around a lot lately. This is really that data mesh vision. Like, how do you get different parts of your organization? Because sure, there's a lot of organizations that has one data platform team, but there's many more that have many data platform teams.
I mean, some companies have multiple CIOs, right?
Yeah, exactly. So how do you make, again, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, how do you make your data accessible in an ad hoc way, but in a compliant way, if that's all spread out? So again, this is why you need that central metadata location so that different parts of the organization can plug in their own data and make their own rules. And so that's another key aspect about what we built is we did not assume a single God user in Immuta that makes all the rules, right? It's more of a data mesh architecture where different domains of your organization can plug in their own data and make their own rules without messing with each other's rules. And this still provides a single and consistent way to enforce policy that's recognizable and understandable to the organization as a whole in your legal compliance teams. So that is a critical piece to this, and why metadata is so important and a consistent way to enforce policy is so important. Because like you said, there's just not that many organizations that have a single data platform team unless we're talking to like small companies, right?
So how much audit trails and the ability to diagnose, drill down into incidents, do you think is needed in a modern data governance solution?
Yeah, like I said, we are more of the proactive take on this, where you
Oh,
should be,
so if something goes wrong, you guys just wash your hands.
well, so it depends.
Yeah,
Defining what goes wrong, I think, is the key
yeah,
point here.
yeah.
So I think if you're talking data quality and things like that, you
No,
need
no,
to have
literally data governance, something. Uh, by the way, the reason I'm bringing this up is if you read anything about information security or data security, or even cybersecurity in general, almost 90% of the time it's social engineering.
yes,
Right? So you can have the best defense, but then social engineering is hard to overcome, right? So
right. So we, like I said, we're mostly, you set the rules, and it's almost like a set and forget and future proof in terms of how you build the rules. Now, that doesn't mean I can't trick Ben Lorica into giving me his database credentials somehow, right? With
yeah,
the
and then
social engineering.
if that happens, you must
Right.
have the ability to figure out what happened, right?
So yes, you can go back and go in our audit logs and say, oh, look, there was a ton of queries from Ben at midnight at last Thursday or whatever. That looks weird. We do not do those kinds of anomaly detection algorithms, though. We simply give you consistent audit logs across all your compute so that you could do that analysis more effectively.
So what's so modern data governance? Would you consider them part of? Are they part of security at this point?
In terms of organizationally, you mean?
Yeah, or just yes, yeah.
Uh, not well. It's a fair question. I think in the same way that your data platform teams need to manage credentials to the database, and that's how they're involved with security, is in the same vein as how the data platform team has to manage privacy controls to keep the legal compliance teams happy. So I think they are a consulted and informed kind of relationship, and not the actual person that's responsible and accountable for doing the work in a lot of cases.
So we mentioned social engineering, which is not, there's no real technology solution to that, really. Um, so what other I guess weaknesses or blind spots, or I guess on more positive spin, what criteria should I have when I'm starting to get serious about data governance and looking at solutions?
Yeah, I think the two big ones, like I already mentioned about, are scalability and stability. How can I build as few rules as possible to do what I need to do in an understandable way that like anyone in the organization can understand what's going on? I think some of our legacy open source solutions that exist today are very non-scalable. And it's kind of, you get into these situations where if the one person that knew how to build all these rules gets hit by a bus, like you're in big trouble. If you're not that one person, you're afraid to make any changes. And I think we see a lot of customers in that situation before they move to us. So I think it's the scalability piece, the stability piece, like we talked about. How do you do that? How do you add automation around everything you do with data governance so that you have a modern data governance solution? And I think the third piece is anonymization. It's got to be more than how do I block tables? How do I block columns? It's got to be advanced anonymization techniques, because these regulations,
So
they're,
describe, make that distinction.
yeah. So I'll give you a good concrete example. So it's like, it's my favorite article in a tabloid ever. So I forget what tabloid it was, but some tabloid took the New York taxi data, which is an open source data source that gives you all the pickups and drop offs at like 5 meter resolution. We're talking GIS again. Have some GIS fun here. So of all the taxi and drop-offs and pickups in New York City, and the time down to like the second of when it happened. So what this tabloid did, and there's nothing sensitive in that data, right? It's just the taxi medallion and the pickup and drop-off. Like that's it. And so the New York Taxi Commission is saying, yeah, this is fine. Let's just release this to the public. Like, you could do some good, right? And so what the tabloid did is they had a picture, I forget what celebrity it was, getting out of their cab with the taxi medallion in the background and the exact timestamp of the picture. And so all you need to do is take the medallion and the timestamp, and you can figure out the taxi ride amongst millions and millions of taxi rides in this data set. And this is an example of an indirect identifier, or what's called a linkage attack, where you take some outside knowledge and link it to the data to break privacy. And so the problem is, if you mask things like people's names and social security numbers, their direct identifiers, that's fine. And that works well. But the problem is you have all these indirect identifiers that live in your data. And if you blindly mask those, then you make your data completely useless, because essentially any column can be an indirect identifier.
This is this is the data fusion dilemma, right? So which is basically a lot of companies want to build this customer data platform where they fuse all of the data sources, but then every single piece of data that you add builds a bigger and bigger picture.
Exactly. And then any outside knowledge that someone might have, which you have no idea what it could be, essentially anything could be an indirect identifier. And so you can't just naively block everyone's access to all that, because now your data is useless. So you need to have, again, that dimmer switch instead of the light switch. So we could apply techniques like k-anonymization and randomized response and differential privacy. And these advanced techniques let you fuzz the data in that column just enough so that, I know fuzz is such a technical term, but you fuzz that data just enough so that you can't do those kinds of linkage attacks, but you're giving enough utility from that data for your analysts to do their work. And if you're not thinking about that, then data governance is going to be a brake rather than an accelerator. You're not going to get people access to more data. You're going to be taking access away and making your analysts unhappy. So I think those are the three things. It's the scalability, stability, and anonymization.
So at this point, it's fair to say data governance, you no longer need to explain what it is when you go to a company, right? So not much education needed or conversion. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So when we first started the company, we had to explain to customers why they need Immuta. That doesn't happen anymore. Customers have internalized this problem. I think the first realization they have is, I've got all these compute engines. I need a single way to enforce policy. Again, going back to that scalability thing, I need to build policy in one place and have it apply everywhere. And so that's like the initial realization. And then like once you get past that layer, then they start talking about, well, how do we automate all this and make it policy as code? And then when you get a layer below that, it's how do we anonymize the data effectively? And so they've internalized at least that first layer, sometimes all three. Like, I get really excited when I have a customer that has internalized all three. But yeah, it's super commonplace. And I would even argue the last year is exploded in terms of just like knowing it's something that needs to be fixed.
So you mentioned that you folks are mostly in the structured realm, but obviously unstructured data is becoming more accessible for companies, right? So not just text, but computer vision and even audio and video. So any plans to venture into those realms?
I don't know. To be honest, we don't get too much demand from that. We've been very focused on the data warehouse vendors in the SaaS world. And we can do things like object level controls. So let's say you have video files or images, like we can still restrict down to the actual object. We just don't do inter-file redaction or anonymization right now. So I don't know. I'm not sure if we'll ever try to tackle that. I think where we're kind of more excited about is how do we even better quantify where your risk lies in the organization and how to automatically remediate that risk. is a piece of what we're talking about. And then also, how do we become even better? We already centralize metadata. How do we make even more use of that metadata that we're centralizing to bring more value to our customers?
What about Steve? What about not necessarily unstructured data, but semi-structured data from sensors and IoT? Do you guys
Yeah.
real-time kind of applications?
So a lot of times what ends up there
Is there
happening
such a
there,
thing as real-time data governance? Is that a thing?
yeah, well, it's real time in terms of the analyst query. So another thing
Yeah.
I didn't really talk about, I didn't get into the innards of how it works, but we do not create copies of data or anonymized versions of data because that just turns into an ETL nightmare, whatever version of the ELs you want to talk about. But the so everything happens dynamically at query time. So if you query the same table as me, you may see a completely different anonymized version than I will because of our different access layers. And that all just happens magically through Immuta without the consumer even realizing it. They're going directly against their Databricks Delta tables, for example. The But to your point, yeah, like a lot of times we'll see customers that store everything in structs in, for example, Parquet files that they want to leverage in Databricks. And so, yes, we have capabilities that we can, in fact, we just added that for one of our customers was something that they asked for. And so we can do things like hide certain layers of the elements in that struct based on who you are. So it is kind of a semi-structured use case from that perspective.
By the way, I before we started talking, I mentioned this new Google paper on data cascades, which basically I think a lot of people should read, and I will link to it in the episode notes as well. I'll also link to Immuta's data engineering survey. But the interesting thing about data cascades is the mindset of, you've got to take data seriously from ingestion all the way to consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that data governance can also have cascades, right? So if there's a failure at one end, it could propagate across the organization.
Absolutely, and I think that it's part of the full cascade, right? Like if I make a change, let's say you've got a whole data pipeline and it's feeding tables that service a dashboard that the CEO gets to see every Friday before the weekend, and someone makes a policy change, that's going to be a cascading problem, right? Like if someone changed the anonymization level of a column that services that dashboard for the CEO, and all of a sudden they're going to be like, "Whoa, wait a minute, why did this column go away?" Right? And so again, that's kind of what I mentioned when I said, I'm sorry, what I meant when I mentioned that we want to be more focused on our metadata layer and how we could kind of proactively answer those kinds of questions up front, where you could say, "Hey, look, like almost think of it almost like a linter for when you make a policy change. You sure you want to do that? Because that change is going to cascade and cause a lot of problems to your downstream analytics. Here's the impact of that change." And we could actually give a privacy first utility impact of that change. Like that's how we want to think about that in terms of just beyond just breaking something.
So based on your conversations with customers, do you detect, Steve, a difference in level of awareness and appreciation for data governance, across industries, so finance versus health versus retail, and across geographies, countries?
That is a great question. I would say there's differences within industry, but geographies, I think the EU is definitely more anonymization aware than the US is, I would say. But there's just levels of maturity and kind of, I call them philosophical alignment too. There's just some companies that want to have 6 humans approve access to data anytime someone wants access to a table, and there's just no talking them out of modernizing that.
My
And
God.
I tell
that that really slows you down, right?
Yeah. So I tell my sales team, I'm like, we can't sell to those kinds of customers. We need to be philosophically aligned. They need to want to modernize how they do data governance. And that, again, I think that's why we focus on these data platform teams, because they understand that they need to have scalability and stability in how they do everything, or they're just going to fail at their job.
But
And
imagine
so,
being a data user in one of these companies and the frustration, right?
oh, it's
So,
terrible.
because
It's
basically,
terrible.
what I have to wait I have to wait for 6 signatures before I can even touch this data.
Right, and it's coarse grain access, right? And the reason it takes 6 signatures is because they don't know how to anonymize at the column or cell level, so they basically have to give the user the entire table, which means they need an act of God to get that far. So that's what I mean when I say when you have coarse grain governance, you are going to frustrate your data analysts. You need fine grain data governance.
So, where is data governance headed? So, if you were to give a talk 2 years from now, what would you like to talk about?
I think
Two
data
years from now,
governance.
man. So, weigh your
Yeah.
words carefully.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll get this wrong, but the but I think it's the policy as code stuff. I think just like DBT changed the world for how people manage data transformations, I want to see Immuta change the world with how you manage policy management and do that as in like an infrastructure as code paradigm or a data pipeline as code paradigm. And I think that's going to change the way all organizations manage their data platforms and the scalability, stability that comes along with that. Like you need to treat your data governance just like you treat your data quality, just like you treat your data pipelines, just like you treat your ingest frameworks and monitoring. Like it's just as critical to all that and adding automation around
So,
it as
yeah,
anything
yeah.
else.
When you say that, so I've spent time talking to the founders of Databricks uh, about pipelines, for example. So one of the things there is how do we inject rigor into pipelines, right? So software engineering rigor in particular, because software engineering, there's practices, right, around testing, unit tests, integration tests, and stuff like
That's
that.
right.
So is that
Exactly.
what you mean by, so you want data governance to have some
Yes,
similar rigor?
exactly.
Yeah,
Like testing frameworks, like
yeah.
yes, all that. So it is a good way to explain it is it's applying software engineering practices to data governance instead of lawyers in a room smoking cigars.
Yeah, injecting that
Data governance.
software
Yeah.
engineering rigor.
Yes, that's
So
exactly right.
so right now, in your mind, it's not quite there yet.
No, I think people want that,
Yeah,
but they don't know how to get there.
I
And
see.
that's what we want to provide them. And I think we already have the foundational pieces of that, and that's only going to get better and stronger over the next 2 years. And I envision a world where like you don't even think about infrastructure as code now because of what AWS and the other clouds have done, right? So in that same way, I think we'll be in a state where like it's gotten so good that the data governance
Actually,
pieces of the organization,
this makes a lot of sense. Uh, as I think about pipelines, what we were talking about in the area of pipelines, because it's very similar in some ways. So what you want to be able to do, for example, with data governance is how do I roll out a new version of data governance safely, right? Just like you want to roll out software safely,
that's right.
right? So
That's exactly right.
how do I test it, right? So rigorously, uh, take advantage of modern software engineering tools to test it. Uh, yeah, it didn't occur to me, but you're right, because basically it's at that level of criticality and importance that you really need to inject rigor.
Yeah, I mean, data governance needs to get out of the boardroom and email ballot like verification and into code. I mean, that's what it comes down to. And I think people are starting to realize that because it's holding everyone back if they don't.
Who are who are the most likely people to get this right away? I guess the platform people, right?
The data platform people, absolutely, and the organizations that put data first, the organizations that their whole business rides on managing their data and making sure data gets into their analysts' hands appropriately. So, anyone whose business lives and dies on their data being right and accessible is thinking about this way.
So then you want so once this happens, then Steve, you can go to a company if you're using such tools within the company, you can say, well, okay, so let's make some changes to our data governance policy, and this is what's going to happen if we do that. We've tested it. This is what's going to happen.
Right. It's just like you submit a change to code, 2 people have to review it. You have unit tests along with it. You've got integration tests that run. Like everyone gives it the thumbs up. You release it. You could roll back.
Right.
All that good stuff. But again, like one thing I didn't really talk about is that all is good and well, but if you're not doing it in a scalable way, it still becomes unmanageable. And so there's like a bunch of nuance in here that we didn't really get into. Like we applied ABAC, attribute-based access control model, instead of RBAC model. I would argue like using RBAC is kind of like writing code without using variables. You basically have to restate the same thing over and over again with
Right.
slight changes, because you're kind of conflating who the user is with what they have access to. So if you don't have a scalable model for how you do access control, it doesn't matter how well you do the software engineering practice piece, you're still going to be in a mess. So you really need those 2 things together, the scalability and the stability.
So what's the role of machine learning in data governance?
I mean, this is some of the stuff we're thinking about with, can we quantify risk and remediate risk without involving a human? That's one piece of it. I think understanding where your sensitive data lives is another piece of it. Potentially lineage. I know there's been a lot of work there in terms of like parsing SQL. That is a nut that still hasn't been perfectly cracked. And I think lineage plays a big part in data governance, because you can understand the trail of where data went and the impact analysis that I talked about before. Like if you make this policy change, like what are the downstream impacts of that? I feel like machine learning is going to eventually play a part in lineage as well.
By the way, as you were talking, it occurred to me. So what do people do now? Let's say I have a data governance policy. It's working great. Then I decide to do this migration from whatever, Amazon to Google, or from this database system to that. Can I quantify the impact on data governance for a migration, or are there tools that automatically migrate my data governance to?
Yeah, that's kind of the beauty in our solution, at least, because again, if you build all the rules at the semantic layer, you had your semantic layer here, and it said mask anything, tag credit card numbers, and then when you move it over to your new system, it's still going to be tagged credit card numbers, so the policy still applies.
So even if I change a little bit the tables along the way.
Right.
Interesting.
Right.
Interesting.
Right. So that's the value of separating policy from compute. Just like the value of separating compute from storage. So it gives you that abstraction.
Very cool. And with that, thank you, Steve. And I look forward to this. I'm super excited about this notion of data governance being like software engineering. That would be, yeah. What's the timeline for that, if you were to guess?
I mean, I think we're doing it now, but I think it would be mainstream, and like you said, in the next 2 years, in my opinion. It needs to be.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Good to see you again.